Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Weber. I'm co-director of the Piers Cumbria School of Medicine Research Hub, and I welcome you this afternoon to the latest webinar in our research webinar series. These webinars tackle aspects of research which are highly topical and bring together researchers from Imperial College, from the University of Cumbria, from NHS partners in North Cumbria, NCIC, and other trusts, in order to discuss those research topics of interest to, we hope, all of us. We encourage a very broad audience to come to these webinars, including staff, doctors, nurses, and staff and students, patients and their relatives, and the general public. So this afternoon's talk is on aspects of innovations for well-being, firstly around psychedelics and the role of psychedelics for depression, second on how to access young people as co-researchers, building agency to influence health and other systems. So without further ado, it's an enormous pleasure to welcome Professor David Nutt, a long-standing colleague at Imperial College, who's professor of neuropsychopharmacology at Imperial and director of the Imperial Psychedelics Research Unit. David.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll just share my slides. Okay, so can you all see them?
They're not up yet. They're up now.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation. And at some point, I look forward to coming up and seeing you all in person. So hopefully, this will incentivize you to invite me. So I'm going to talk about psychedelics for depression. You can see there a recent book I wrote for the general public on psychedelics, which encapsulates a lot of what I'm going to say today, as the background as well as some of the research we're doing here at Imperial. And I should say Imperial was the first university in the world to formally endorse a Center for Psychedelic Research, for which I am very pleased. So today I'm going to talk about what are called serotonergic psychedelics, and some of them are the most common ones are shown on this slide. There are other kinds of psychedelics, but I haven't got time to go into those. These are the most commonly used ones. They're almost certainly the first medicines for mental health, because human beings, when they started exploring the natural world to find foods, would have come across these. And they exist in pretty much all continents on the earth. Some of them come from cacti, some come from mushrooms, some are cocktails of particular herbs which are made in plants, which are put together to produce a biologically orally active psychedelic called DMT. One comes from toads and other plants. But the most important image really here is this image on the bottom left. So this is psychedelics come from a range of organisms. They come from fungi, they come from cacti, they come from some animals. And some of them, like LSD, are semi-synthetic. They're derived from an ergot, a fungal-produced molecule called lysergic acid. This graph shows the chemical structure of some of them, but it also shows the fact that they all work through binding to a particular receptor in the brain called the 5-HT2A receptor. And the affinity of the drugs, the stickiness of the drugs for this receptor defines the clinical dose. Very sticky drugs like LSD, you use very low doses, micrograms. Drugs like psilocybin and DMT, which have less affinity, you might use milligram, 10s to 30s of milligrams. And drugs like mescaline, you might need to use almost up to a gram. So the affinity at the receptor determines their dosing. The receptor's cloned. We know its structure, its protein structure. We know where these drugs bind. We know their effects are mediated through intracellular messengers called G proteins. Many of them are analogs of serotonin, which is a natural neurotransmitter there. So psilocybin in particular is a very close analog. But these molecules also contain binding sites like serotonin for the 2A receptor. And we also know that many drugs we use clinically, particularly in psychiatry, are blockers of that receptor, and they block the effects of psychedelics. the next slide shows the distribution of these 5-HT2A, serotonin 2A receptors in the human brain. And what is remarkable about these is that they're most densely expressed in the most recently evolved parts of the brain. No. Okay, the left-hand image is what we call a heat map. It's the density of the receptors in the brain, and it's labeled using a tracer that we developed here at Imperial called 11-carbon SYMB36. So the hotter the area of the brain, the higher the density of the receptors. On the right-hand side, the right-hand brain is a heat map of the evolution of the human brain. The hotter, the redder it is, the more recently evolved. And you can see there's a remarkable parallel between the distribution of these receptors in the human brain and the evolution of the human brain. And we wrote a paper recently suggesting maybe these receptors actually facilitate the massive expansion of the human brain, which is so characteristic of the human brain compared with other primate brains. I can't prove that, but it's an interesting theory. But what is critical to what I'm going to tell you subsequently is that the main effect of psychedelics is on those receptors, and those receptors are in the most recently evolved parts of the brain. These are the parts of the brain which do the things that only humans can do in great depth and with a great efficiency, and that's thinking, reflecting, planning, analysis, language, etc. So when we use psychedelics in people, they change the highest functions of the human brain. Next slide, please. And we can study their impact on the brain using a range of different imaging techniques. This one is called magnetoencephalography, or MEG. It's a kind of super EEG, but it gives the same kind of results as electroencephalography. What you see here are images of different drugs on the MEG signal. We go from top to bottom of the rows, and those are different frequency bands. The brain produces frequencies which range from about 3 hertz up to about 100 hertz. The color coding is power. The redder the color, the more power, the more the brain is locked into that particular frequency. So if you look on the right-hand side, in the red rectangle, you see 2 psychedelics, LSD and psilocybin, and you also see ketamine, which is used currently as a kind of psychedelic because it's legally available. And you see most of the coloring there is blue, and blue means reduced power. And reduced power in a particular frequency means increased flexibility of brain function. Psychedelics and ketamine desynchronize the brain. We produce a state which we've termed the entropic brain, a state of much increased ability to change the way the brain works. On the other side, you see a whole range of drugs like anesthetics, sedatives, etc., that do the opposite. They make the brain more rigid in its activity. That's synchronized. Synchronicity limits change, limits thinking. Next slide, please. As a result of doing studies, imaging studies with psychedelics, we were able to work with biomathematicians to come up with ways of visualizing the impact of this entropy. And this is the most beautiful one, and it's become almost a meme for our research. On the left-hand side is what is the normal brain, and that's what we call the small world brain. And it's called the small world brain because most of the processing in your brain is done very locally. Visual cortex talks to visual cortex, auditory cortex to auditory cortex. Your brain is 10 times more energy efficient to information transfer than the best human computers because it does so much of its processing very locally. Of course, if you hear a bus bearing down on you, you've got to get your auditory cortex to tell your motor cortex. You've got to move your legs. But the energy efficiency of the brain is driven by the fact that so much of the processing is deeply encoded very locally. And that has huge advantages. So every word I have mentioned to you today, you've understood. You might have understood the concepts that they've come together to mean, but once you learn a word, it's almost impossible to unlearn a word. But if we go to the next slide, please, or click onto the build. What happens if you learn the wrong thing? What happens if you're told by your parents that you're useless? And you begin to believe that because you don't know any better. And you continually learn on a daily basis, you reiterate that belief that you are worthless. Then you become depressed. You dig a ditch of intensive negative thinking. And unlearning that can be very difficult. In fact, there is no treatment we know of that can change the brain to help you unlearn deeply ingrained emotional responses, except for psychedelics. Now, on the right-hand side, you see what happens with a psychedelic, in this case, psilocybin. Psilocybin puts your brain back to as it was as a child, when all connections were possible. And the process of education and development and learning is about taking this vast number of possibilities and constraining them so your brain works the same as everyone else's brain, which, as I say, for learning words is really important. But if you learn the wrong thing, it can be very destructive. So psychedelics can put the brain back to as it was before people learnt to become depressed. And that's why it can lift depression. The next slide. And one of the other reasons we began to study psychedelics in depression is that we found this image. This is an image of what happens when you take psilocybin. And there's a part of the brain at the front of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex that drives depression. And that has been known for over 20 years. And it's been known that most treatments that lift depression do so by reducing activity in that brain region. It may seem paradoxical that your brain would drive depression, but that's just one of the facts of life. And we found that psilocybin would dampen down that brain region, and it would do it immediately, whereas treatments like CBT or SSRIs take weeks to work. So we thought, well, maybe we can lift depression quickly by giving people a psilocybin trip. Next slide, please. How do we do this? Well, you can see how we do it. There's a film called Magic Medicine, which is free on Tubi. Some of you may have seen the BBC program they made on our clinical trial comparing psilocybin with an SSRI. Unfortunately, that's not easily available at present. But the process is quite well defined now. We select people who we believe these medicines will be safe in, people who don't have a history of psychosis. We prepare them quite extensively for the experience so that they maximize the benefit and they minimize any anxiety they might have about the trip. During the trip, they don't talk. They're in a room with a nice ambience. They have therapists present. They have eye shades. They have ear pieces, and they can listen to soundtracks if they like. We encourage them to explore the inner workings of their mind over the few hours in which psilocybin produces these effects. But after the trip, for the subsequent weeks, they engage in a process we call integration, which is essentially psychotherapy, helping people maximally utilize the insights that they get from the trip. And it's that process of changing the way you think during the trip and building on those experiences, particularly the possibility, the reality of change, that leads to the therapeutic benefit, which is shown on the next slide, please. So this is the first study published in 2016. We took 20 people who had treatment-resistant depression. In fact, one of them, if you see the Tubi film, one of them came from just around the corner from where you live, just across the border in Scotland. And you can see that they all had failed on at least 2 antidepressants. They'd all failed on cognitive behavioral therapy. And the first single dose of psilocybin, 25 milligram dose, produced a halving of the depression scores. It occurred almost immediately. We didn't think it would be that fast, so we didn't measure it just after a couple of days, but by 1 week it was there. It peaked at 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, and it persisted for 3 months. And that is the most powerful single dose treatment of resistant depression that has ever been. And it spawned many companies developing psilocybin and other psychedelics for depression. Next slide, please. And here are some of the results. In many countries, psychedelics have been shown to reduce depressive scores. And the top right-hand image is the most important one because this is a remarkable study, a study conducted in 7 different countries, multiple languages, 2 continents, showing a dose-response relationship, where the blue line is a 25 milligram dose that we used, and then the green line is a 10 milligram dose, and the black line above is a 1 milligram placebo dose. And this replicates our data almost exactly. And now the company that did that, Compass Pathways, is conducting a phase 3 trial. And if that's positive, then it's very likely that psilocybin will become an approved medicine by the FDA. Next slide, please. I mentioned the BBC filmed us doing this trial. This is the one and only so far head-to-head comparison of psilocybin versus the SSRI, escitalopram, which is the most selective SSRI. And it shows a couple of things. On the left-hand side, the red bars are the changes in mood, the reductions in depression for psilocybin, which exceed those of escitalopram in blue. The bottom table shows something remarkable, that between 2 and 4 times as many of the patients got fully recovered. They got into remission on psilocybin as compared with escitalopram. And the reason for that is that not only that psilocybin is a more powerful treatment, but it also doesn't have the side effects of escitalopram. And that's why on the right-hand image, the right-hand graph, you can see the well-being scores are considerably greater for psilocybin in red than escitalopram in blue. So psilocybin doesn't just lift depression, it improves well-being. And that well-being, we believe, gives resilience and helps protect people against further relapses. And it also explains why there's increased improvements in sleep and also measures of anxiety and gut symptoms. Next slide, please. Now, in both of those depression trials, we did brain imaging. We never imaged patients when they're having a trip, because that could be very counter-therapeutic, but we imaged their brains before and after the trip. And this particular image is an image taken 3 weeks after a psilocybin trip in the escitalopram trial. And it shows something that was really remarkable and almost unique, because the top images in red are the changes in brain flexibility produced by psilocybin 3 weeks after a trip. The measure is called modularity. Modularity is a measure of rigidity of brain thinking. And you can see in the psilocybin group, the top left-hand box, rigidity goes down, the brain becomes more flexible. And that reduction in rigidity correlates with clinical outcome. And it also explains improvements in symptoms. Depressed people are able to think more clearly. They can go to work. They can add up databases. They can read books. Their brain is more functioning than it was in depression. The bottom images in blue are escitalopram. Escitalopram does not increase flexibility in the brain. It lifts depression, but it doesn't increase flexibility. And what is remarkable about the psilocybin images is that accords remarkably with what the patients say. They say their brains are more flexible. They say, usually they just use computer analogies. It's like you defragged my brain, like you reformatted my hard drive. So now I can think like I used to. I'm not locked into repetitive thinking that I had when I was depressed. Next slide, please. And just very quickly, what we now have are 2 ways of lifting depression. The top row is the traditional way. It's how antidepressants work. Antidepressants lift depression by blocking stress responses in a part of the brain called the amygdala. And over time, that blocking of stress leads to the brain to heal. But it takes time. And that's why antidepressants can take up to 6 to 8 weeks to work. The bottom image, the bottom row, the red, that's psychedelics. Psychedelics work in a different part of the brain. They work in the thinking part of the brain, where people repeatedly ruminate on negative thoughts in depression. It breaks down that thinking through another receptor, a different receptor, the 2A receptor. So it breaks down this inflexible, perseverative thinking, which is the characteristic of depression, and leads to cognitive flexibility and well-being. Next slide, please. So now it's very pleasing to me as a psychiatrist, because my patients are now in a similar position to those with other common disorders like cancer and hypertension. They have alternative treatments if one fails. Next slide, please. And I want to just show you this quote from one patient who had both treatments. And he said, where escitalopram, the SSRI, nulled me to be less scared, it blunts stress responses. Psilocybin has made me realize that fear is not something to be feared. It resets people's attitude to life, to the threats of life. Next slide, please. This is a wonderful quote from George Bernard Shaw, the philosopher, playwright. Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And that's absolutely true, of course, for patients with mental illness. But Australia has changed its mind. 2 years ago, the Australian regulator, the TGA, decided that psilocybin had enough evidence from senior academic centres like ours to make it available as a medicine. And they did. And they've now agreed it's not only should it be a medicine, but it can also now be paid for by the state for people with veterans, military veterans who need it. Germany has recently come to the same conclusion. They're making it available. The Czech Republic would do so next year. And what we need to do now is persuade our government that this really radical breakthrough in the treatment of depression is something that should be allowed in this country. Next slide, please. So I'll finish now by thanking the funders of this, particularly the charity, the Alexander Moseley charity. This young man in the middle here, he died in his 20s. He committed suicide, and his family gave us his legacy to fund the research, particularly in depression. So we're very grateful to him. They hope that our work may reduce the risk of other young men and other people killing themselves. So thank you very much.
David, thank you so much for that. And now, great pleasure to introduce Professor Amanda Taylor-Bezic, Professor of Digital Health at the Institute of Health at the University of Cumbria. Amanda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Georgia, will you share our slides? And David, just to say that's fascinating work, and I definitely will follow that up. Phenomenal work. And hopefully you can convince the government. Colleagues, thank you so much for the invite to present as the Cumbria Co-Research Collective and present as part of your seminar series. As Jonathan has said, I'm Professor Amanda Taylor-Bezic, Professor of Digital and Social Sciences at the University of Cumbria. And it's wonderful to be able to share the work that we've been doing in Cumbria with young people with a wider health and social care and interested public, and how youth-driven inquiry approaches generating meaningful and place-based change for young people in Cumbria, particularly in relation to their health and well-being trajectories. But in keeping with our flattened power structure in this collective and a commitment that we have to democratic practice, I've been delegated the opening slides to situate this work, to foreground young people's agency, and to reflect on how I'm using my academic position to create opportunities and spaces in which that agency can be realised, whilst also keeping in mind and holding quite tightly to something that co-researchers, young people, taught me very long time ago, and that was, please do create space for us, but please know when to shut up and get out of the way. And I'm really pleased also that when I don't do that, that they feel confident enough to tell me to do so. John, just the next slide then, Georgia. So who are we as a co-research collective? Might go on to the next one as well, Georgia. For the project you'll hear about today, and noting that the collective expands and changes and new youth workers come on board, new young people come on board, and we join across multiple projects as our experience at the moment. But for the project that Georgia will outline to you as an example of our research work, the youth co-research team at this point was, as it says on the screen here, Ash, Sophie, Oriel, Molly, Charlie, and Haley. And it's worth noting as well that Ash has gone on now to be a salaried Carlisle Youth Zone youth co-researcher and is progressing therefore as a social researcher in the Cumbria region, which is one of the things well, there's many things I'm proud of in this work, but that's one thing I'm particularly proud of, you know, given my choice to come to Cumbria and be part of a place-based institution, and also due to my experiences of pursuing academic volunteering as a means to opening up material pathways into research for youth workers and young people. And we'll move to the next slide, Georgia. And alongside that, this is another part of the co-research collective. We have got Joey, who is part of ONSI, which is the network organisation for youth zones in England. We've got Ro and Georgia that you're going to hear from quite shortly as a youth peer co-researcher from Carlisle Youth Zone. And Georgia also in her formal role as a CYZ participation officer, really central to the presence of this work and the development of this work. And as a side point, if you're interested in political theatre as a means to communicating your research findings, please do talk to Georgia, because she's got a real flair for that in terms of impact of her research in the populations of interest. We've also got on there Emily and Lauren from Boing Boing Foundation, who have also grown into their own research careers, now salaried co-researchers and core to the Blackpool HDRC work, which centres youth voice in their research projects. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Laura Snell, whose huge amount of often unseen labour keeps lots of our projects moving forward. And Allende is a PhD candidate at the University of Cumbria, who made a really good contribution to the literature synthesis, data analysis for the work you're going to hear about today. So just a bit more, next slide from me, Georgia. So I will be handing over to Georgia quite short. This is just a kind of brief journey that we have been on as a collective. So as I mentioned, through my volunteer role at CYZ, I became really aware, really acutely aware that young people had things they wanted to talk about, and that they themselves, felt were very pressing to how they're experiencing the world. So conversations with them and exploring routes to making inroads to addressing the things that they were bringing to the fore was sort of the catalyst then to secure internal research funding from the University of Cumbria. This was to develop young people for research readiness, to build capacity in them as co-researchers, not just to extract information about them and of them, but to get them involved central to the projects. So in terms of engagement, we deployed youth-centered language and culture, borrowing from something you might know if you're on TikTok, Get Ready With Me. I'm not sure if you've seen that on TikTok, but it's a format through which we felt we could communicate the relevance of the work and the opportunity for young people and develop their confidence in the possibilities of being a researcher rather than being a research participant and having that more extractive experience. So we went on to recruit. We had 2 Saturday recruitment days and upskilling events, and that was supported through a peer-to-peer approach facilitated by Emily and Lauren from Boing Boing Foundation, drawn on their own experiences of becoming researchers, becoming research ready, and building capacity, therefore, in other young people. So from this work, the Cumbria Youth Co-Research Collective was born, really. And through using research investigation cards as a method, we identified specific areas of concern for this group of young people. And the strong and consistent theme throughout that was mental health experiences that were hindering their mental health experiences that didn't necessarily need to hinder the mental health. And these 2 then exploratory projects supported the development then of youth and youth co-researchers, but at the same time surfaced important issues requiring deeper inquiry. So I'm going to hand over to Georgia, and Georgia's just going to take you sort of briefly through a research project that we've been involved with, have just completed, and we've just reported on, and we will report on again on Monday evening to the elected members and one of the community panels across the Cumbria and Cumberland region. So Georgia, will I just mute and hand over to you?
That's great. Thank you, Amanda.
Brilliant.
Ash was unfortunately supposed to join me, but was not very well, so is not here with me today. So I am presenting for both myself and Ash. But we first wanted to start off with presenting a little bit about the Lundy model. This model was developed by academic Laura Lundy, a professor of international children's rights, and it provides a way of conceptualizing a child's right to participation as laid down in Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The model intends to provide organisations working with and for children and young people with and for a checklist, basically, to aid in the compliance of the Article 12. The collective has utilised this as a basis for both working together and when conducting their research projects. So the model is made up of 4 sections. Space, it provides a safe and inclusive space for children to express their views. So that is asking, have children's views been actively sought? Was there a safe space in which children can express themselves freely? Have steps been taken to ensure that all children can take part? It then moves on to voice. Provide appropriate information and facilitate the expression of children's views. Have children been given the information they need to form a view? Do children know that they do not have to take part? Have children been given a range of options as to how they might choose to express themselves? Audience. Ensure that children's views are communicated to someone with the responsibility to listen. Is there a process for communicating children's views? Do children know who their views are being communicated to? Does that body have the power to make decisions? Influence. Ensure that children's views are taken seriously and acted upon where appropriate. Were the children's views considered by those with the power to effect change? Are there procedures in place that ensure that children's views have been taken seriously? Have the children and young people been provided with feedback, explaining the reasons for decisions that have been taken? So this is things that we were considering as we went through our research work. So, I'll go, we've jumped, sorry, go back quickly. Yes, here we are. So when starting out with the Get Research Ready sessions, we first had to figure out what the right question to ask was. So the youth co-researchers created and asked, how can petrol community area be more youth friendly? We then designed a survey using both closed questions and open questions, as we thought this was the best way to hear a wide range of young people's ideas and views and to obtain both qualitative and quantitative data. We also conducted workshops to explore the questions in different ways and ensure accessibility to all. This was especially effective for younger age groups who just needed a little bit more guidance. So, after creating the survey, we then moved into the fieldwork stage by going into the community and engaging young people with the survey. We received 200 and it says 44, but we actually got 54 responses in total. That included all of the workshops that we did, which we were very, very proud of. And we visited 14 different places within the petrol community area to obtain them. These included schools, youth groups, local parks. We found that young people were more relaxed in their own spaces, and especially when we brought along some sweets and some drinks, especially in the hot weather, the drinks went down very well. After gathering the research, we moved into the reviewing the findings. The data was put into graphs and sorted into 4 different themes. So the 4 themes we sorted the data into were theme 1, supporting new and existing groups delivering provision for children and young people. Theme 2, supporting and encouraging children and young people to thrive. Theme 3, supporting intervention and prevention. And theme 4, supporting inclusivity and diversity. Along with those 4 themes, we also had several types of graphs to help visualize the findings. And here are some of those findings. So, here we have a net promoter score of the responses to the question. Overall, do you feel there are enough youth-friendly spaces and places in the petrol community area? This represents that overall young people do not feel like there are enough youth-friendly spaces. The next one is a thematic mapping of the responses to the question, what else do you like to have the opportunity to do after school on a weekend in your local area? The bigger the responses show how often that they were said. So we can see football is quite prominent there. These are grouped responses to the question, how can children and young people be supported more, better to thrive, grow up and develop well in the petrol community area? Most people said that they wanted more access and more events for young people and youth clubs and groups. So the first graph on this slide shows responses to the question, do you know of any interventions and preventions that are currently happening in the petrol community area? Most people don't or are unsure on this question. The second graph represents responses to the question, would you like opportunities to be involved in activities and action towards addressing issues or preventing issues? And most people would like opportunities. This thematic mapping highlights responses to the question, what do you think makes a community diverse and inclusive? Again, the bigger the word is, the more it was said. And the last one is a bar graph of the responses for the question, how would you describe the petrol community area in terms of diversity, inclusion, and equality? This is the specific responses for young people living in the Curragh area, which is CO2. So this is the one I skipped to earlier, but this was the young people, the youth co-researchers, they wanted to represent their findings in a more creative way, as well as alongside the more traditional methods with the graphs and things like this. So this was actually a poem that Ash created, and which I'll read out now on their behalf. So when people wish to hang out, where should they go? To the abandoned building, to restricted zones, or to nowhere? You could say, why don't you hang around the parks or outside like everyone else? Yet you get mad at them being there. In reality, there is nowhere for them. Youth spaces are sparse, knowledge of them is low, so people look out for where they shouldn't go. So that was just a culmination of looking at the research and sort of picking out the bits that really stood out to those young people. And it was really interesting to see the variety of poems. This was just one, but each of the youth co-researchers came up with them, and they were so different. And it was lovely to see how they had interpreted the data that we collected. So when reflecting on the project, the challenges the youth co-researchers highlighted included that everyone is coming from different backgrounds with different experiences and levels of understanding. Therefore, they will interpret information, opportunities, and needs differently. So that is something that we definitely saw when we were out and about, because as much as it was great taking the surveys out, it was also the conversations that we were having with these young people that we learned so much about them. And it is interesting how much just being by the Hammond's Pond doing fishing compared to being in the Rock, which is another youth organisation, changes what they feel that they need. Young people don't always feel listened to by authority figures. So how do we show that this is different? And that is something that we were really conscious of when we were going out and about into the community as well. Young people may find it difficult to express true feelings as adults, such as parents and carers, can impact and influence their choices despite the differences in experiences. So this is thinking about the fact that young people often listen to what their carers and parents suggest and what their opinions are, and often at this stage for some of them that is what they then follow. And how do we get to the heart of what they want and what is relevant to them? Young people express they want to have a childhood, and they often feel rushed to grow up and make decisions. So again, it's about that giving them the space to be children, while also making sure that they have ownership over how their life is run. We then went on to the opportunities that stood out to the youth co-researchers and the wider collective, was that young people don't always know what is available to them. More information sharing may aid everyone to start with a better knowledge to make full use of opportunities and resources. So a lot of the time we found that it's not that young people weren't aware of the opportunities, but perhaps that it was that the way that we are communicating is different to the way that they communicate them. So, for example, a place name might be very different to those young people, but also then wider having that information available to them, because it's great if it's going out to parents and things like this, but sometimes that doesn't always get filtered through to the young people themselves. And the research also showed that young people want to know more about their community and want to get more involved. And that is something that really stood out to us, that these young people are wanting to be there, wanting to get involved, are really important contributors to this society. I think that then sends us back to you, Amanda.
Brilliant, Georgia. Every time I hear it back, I remember how just brilliant this project was. And I think it's worth noting that it was yourself as a youth work co-researcher and young people walking around the city to all sorts of areas, including, I noticed you didn't mention McDonald's. All the places you went to where they were, it's always really strikes me when and thank you so much for your contribution to this talk today. In terms of what next, colleagues, we're absolutely delighted with all the journey we have been on and the work and the impact that we believe we have made. And we're really delighted that recently we've secured one of the Pairs Cumbria School of Medicine Research Hub BRC bids. And this work will examine and surface principles for young people's agency within their health trajectories. Initially working with the Cumbria GP network, and work it will include a number of stakeholders, including another thing that we're very proud of, the first cohort of students at Pairs Cumbria School of Medicine. Recently, we've also submitted with NEC and wider consortium of partners a £12 million application to look at young people's mental health in the context of and using new technologies. And we've been invited just recently again to work on another Cumberland Council piece of strategy work around youth work, and that's in January 2026. We're recruiting new youth co-researchers all the time and open to hear from more young people and research partners and consortiums interested in working with and in the co. And I think it's worth mentioning another presentation we gave on this petrol project, where an elected member wished to explore this method that we've developed, quoting it as a blueprint for youth participation and involvement across the county. So even though we're on our fourth project, it still kind of feels that we're just beginning. We require funding, as always. It's much more difficult to get funding for young people co-research and projects. But it also, what we're benefiting or evidencing here is also the benefits of academics being in their locality, in their local communities, bringing the university outside and into those communities with a view to, I really believe in this, and I can see this manifesting in front of me with you. You'll see an example with Georgia and the work. When you read the work, there's a report due out on this work. We're presenting the final work on Monday evening next week. But we're preparing the next generation of researchers to lead the university in this county. And I think that in itself is something to focus on when thinking about the wider impacts of this co-research work. So thank you for your time and for showing up for this. You show up for young people. You show up for this time of method. So thank you for the invite again, colleagues. Yeah, we'll try and field any questions if there are any.
Look, can I thank all the speakers most sincerely for a really interesting session, and immensely grateful, and to everyone who has attended today in the audience.